They built the tunnels for smuggling during Prohibition, but something else moved in long ago, something that's been waiting patiently in the darkness ever since. 7 people have encountered it. Only 5 lived to tell their stories, 2 were never found. The Los Angeles Police Department has sealed all records related to these incidents, but tonight, we're exposing everything. Watch at your own risk. I should have known something was wrong when Mrs. Chen stopped coming to our sessions. My terminal patients miss appointments sometimes. It happens. But not Mrs. Chen, not after her diagnosis. She was determined to make peace with everything before. Well, I remember our last session perfectly, sitting in my office overlooking the Red Line station. She kept glancing out the window at those abandoned tunnels. "Rachel," she said, "what if I told you there was another way?" I thought she meant alternative treatments. I wish that's all it was. The thing about being a grief counselor is you learn to read between the lines, to catch those subtle shifts when someone's hiding something. Mrs. Chen was hiding something big. 2 more of my terminal patients disappeared that month. No calls, no messages, just gone. The police didn't take it seriously. People with terminal diagnoses sometimes just want to disappear, they said. But I knew better. I started noticing the pattern. All of them had mentioned the Red Line tunnels in their final sessions, making odd comments about finding another path or walking a different line. I shouldn't have gone down there, but I had to know. The entrance was exactly where Mrs. Chen described, hidden behind the old maintenance door. The air down there, it was different, heavy with incense and something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach turn. The tunnel stretched endlessly, red emergency lights casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then I heard the chanting, low voices echoing off the walls, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I followed the sound, my flashlight beam dancing across the tracks. The chamber opened up suddenly, dozens of candles illuminating faces I recognized. My missing patients. They sat in a circle, eyes closed, swaying. But what made my blood freeze wasn't seeing them. It was seeing who stood in the center. My father. The same man who abandoned us 20 years ago, now wearing dark robes covered in symbols I didn't recognize. He was leading the chant, promising them salvation, immortality, a way to cheat death through some twisted ritual. I must have gasped, because his eyes snapped to mine. There was no recognition there, no warmth, just a cold emptiness that made me turn and run. That should have been the end of it. I should have reported everything to the police, but something stopped me. Maybe it was seeing my father again, or maybe it was the way Mrs. Chen looked, peaceful, almost radiant. Despite everything I knew about her condition, I started digging deeper, found old newspaper clippings about my father's research before he disappeared. He'd been obsessed with ancient meditation practices, claiming they could alter human consciousness, extend life, and then that the university called it pseudoscience and stripped him of his tenure. That's when he left us, or that's what we thought. But now I wonder if he'd already found something down in those tunnels, something he thought was worth abandoning his family for. I tried talking to my mom about it, but she just got this distant look in her eyes. "Your father always chose his work over us," she said. "Don't make the same mistake." But I couldn't let it go. I started watching the station, noting patterns. Every new moon, more people would disappear into those tunnels. Not just my patients anymore, others too. Drawn by whispered promises of eternal life. I've seen what terminal illness does to people, how it makes them grasp at any hope, no matter how dangerous. Last week I got a letter, no return address, just my father's handwriting. "Rachel, you've seen too much, but you could understand if you let yourself. We're waiting." I still hear from some families asking if I've seen their loved ones. I lie and say no. Because how can I tell them the truth? That their mothers and fathers, their wives and husbands, chose to follow my father into the darkness? That sometimes, late at night, I still hear their chanting echoing up through the vents? That I catch glimpses of dark robes disappearing into the tunnels? I've thought about going back down, about confronting him, demanding answers, but I'm afraid of what I might find. Afraid that whatever's down there, it isn't my father anymore. And maybe it never was. The letter sits on my desk now, waiting. Every night, I hear the chanting growing louder, more insistent, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see myself glancing toward the window, toward the tunnels, wondering, Is this hereditary, this need to chase immortality, this willingness to step into darkness? Because lately, I've been dreaming of red lights and ancient words, of candlelit chambers and eternal life, and I'm starting to understand why they all went down there, why they never came back up. Maybe. Some questions are better left unanswered, but I know I won't be able to resist forever. The tunnels are calling, and I am my father's daughter. I never planned on being a hero, especially not at 3 a.m. with a mop in my hand. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if I'd just ignored those sounds coming from behind that old maintenance door. But I guess when you've hit rock bottom yourself, you recognize that sound of desperation. I'd been clean for 8 months when it happened. Working the midnight shift at Union Station wasn't exactly glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me busy during those dangerous hours when the cravings hit hardest. And the night shift was usually quiet, just me, my cleaning cart, and the occasional security guard making rounds. That night started like any other. I was mopping near the West Wing. You know, that section with all the old brass fixtures and Art Deco tiles. The station was practically empty, just the echo of my squeaky wheels and the hum of the ancient heating system. Then I heard it. A muffled cry, so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But there it was again, coming from behind one of those sealed maintenance doors everyone just ignores. I stood there frozen, my hands trembling on the mop handle. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to just keep mopping and pretend I hadn't heard anything. The door wasn't even supposed to open. It led to those old Prohibition tunnels they'd sealed off decades ago. But something made me try the handle. It turned. The metal was cold against my palm, the hinges groaning as I pulled it open. The beam from my flashlight caught something reflecting in the darkness. Fresh boot prints in the dust, leading deeper into the tunnel. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I thought about calling security, but I knew how that would go. They'd take one look at my record and dismiss everything I said. I switched off my flashlight. The darkness pressed in around me as I followed the boot prints. The air got thicker, mustier, then voices, men's voices, speaking in low tones and crying, multiple voices crying. I pressed myself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The voices got clearer as I crept forward. "Get them ready for transport. The truck arrives in 20 minutes. My blood ran cold. I knew exactly what I was hearing, the same way I knew what those crying voices were, what they meant. I'd almost been one of them once, back in my darkest days. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so bad I could barely type. But I managed to send my location to 911. Then I did something really stupid. I stepped into view, my voice stronger than I felt. "Hey, what's going on down here?" The flashlights hit me all at once, blinding me. I heard shouts, running footsteps, but I'd seen them. The girls huddled against the wall, the zip ties. The fear in their eyes. I ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, up those stairs, through that door, straight into a wall of police officers responding to my text. They found 5 girls in those tunnels that night, all of them alive. The traffickers had been using the old bootlegging routes to move people undetected, right under everyone's noses. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those moments in the dark. But then I think about those girls, and I remember why I keep showing up for my shift every night. Because sometimes, being in the right place at the right time, even if you're just the janitor, can change everything, even if your hands are shaking the whole time. The hardest part came after, during the investigation, when I had to face them in court, those men, their cold eyes boring into me as I testified. Every fiber of my being screamed for relief, for just one hit to take the edge off. But I didn't. I couldn't. Those girls needed me to stay strong, to tell their story. My sponsor sat with me through every hearing, holding my hand when it got too much, reminding me why I'd chosen this path. The detectives found more tunnels, a whole network running under the city. Turns out those Prohibition-era smugglers had built quite the maze down there, and these traffickers, they'd been using it for years, moving people through the darkness like ghosts. They offered me a reward, but I couldn't take it. Didn't feel right profiting from someone else's pain. Instead, I asked them to donate it to the recovery center where I got clean. These days, I still work the night shift, but things are different now. The security guards know my name, treat me with respect. Sometimes they ask me to check out suspicious sounds with them because they know I've seen things in those shadows. I know what to look for. The station installed better lighting in the West Wing, put in new security cameras, sealed up those old tunnels for good, but sometimes, late at night, when the station's empty and quiet, I still hear echoes. Not the crying anymore, but something else. The sound of keys jingling as those girls were freed, their first breaths of fresh air as they emerged into the light. You know how they say some things are better left undiscovered? Well, I learned that the hard way with my first big real estate project in LA. I keep trying to tell myself it was just a weird dream, but I know what I found under those buildings was real. I should probably introduce myself. I'm Sarah. I used to be pretty good at my job in real estate development. Not anymore, though. Not since what happened at the Morrison building in the historic core. It was supposed to be simple. Just another old office building we were turning into fancy apartments. Nothing special. But during the basic building check, our radar picked up these weird tunnels underneath. Not normal utility stuff. This was different. I was standing there with my hard hat, staring at these scans, and my project manager kept saying they were just old water lines or something. But I knew better. The whole layout looked way too organized. Then we found the doors, big steel ones, hidden behind this fake wall in the basement, the kind you'd see in a military base, with these old faded signs warning people to stay out. I tried telling myself it was just some forgotten bomb shelter from the Cold War days, but then the singing started. It wasn't like ghost noises or anything, just voices at first coming through the air vents, easy to ignore when you're busy. But this one night I was working late, catching up on paperwork, when I heard them clearly, a group of people singing together. Old songs my grandma used to know. I followed the sound down to those steel doors. They were cracked open just a little bit, with light coming out. I know it was stupid, but I had to look. The tunnel behind those doors wasn't what I expected. It was clean, like really clean, with working lights and everything. Walking deeper, I started seeing these old posters about mental health, weird government symbols I'd never seen before. Then I found where they lived. Imagine walking into a perfect time capsule of the 1960s, except people were actually living there. Real people, going about their day like it was totally normal to be in an underground bomb shelter in 2024. They saw me before I could leave, but they weren't mad. Actually, they seemed kind of excited to talk to someone new. That's when they told me their story. They were part of some government experiment back in the day, volunteers testing if people could live underground long term. When the program ended in 1968, they just decided to stay, made their own little world down there. Margaret was the first one who talked to me. She'd been just a teenager when she joined the program. Her hair's all gray now, but man, her eyes still light up when she talks about their community. She showed me everything. They've got these amazing gardens with special lights, a library full of old books, even a movie room with an old projector. The whole place smells like my grandma's kitchen, always something baking. They told me about their lives, how they fell in love, had kids, built families. Some of the original people passed away over the years, but their community kept growing. They know about the outside world, but only what they choose to learn about. They've got this whole system for filtering out stuff they don't want to deal with. I spent hours down there that first night. Tom, Margaret's husband, showed me how they keep everything running. Power systems, water filters, air circulation, everything's maintained perfectly. They begged me not to tell anyone about them. Said they were happy there, that our world would be too much for them now. Looking at how peaceful their life is, I kind of get it. So I kept their secret. Told my investors the basement was unsafe, changed all our plans. Nobody questioned it. Old buildings always have issues. I visit them sometimes now, bring them stuff, fresh fruit, books from their era. They're like family to me now. But I worry about the future. What happens when some other developer buys the building? Someone who won't understand? Sometimes at night I hear them singing those old songs through the vents. Songs about simpler times and sticking together. Makes me wonder if maybe they've got it figured out better than we do. Maybe sometimes the best way forward is holding on to the good things from the past, even if you have to hide them from the world. I've seen enough bodies in my 15 years with LAPD to know when something's not right. That nagging feeling in your gut, the one that keeps you up at night. I had it from the moment I walked into the nightcap. The speakeasy trend hit LA hard a few years back, but this place was different. Every detail was perfect, too perfect. The brass fixtures, the period-accurate wallpaper, even the bartender's vest looked like it was pulled straight from 1948. I was there investigating my fourth missing persons case in 2 months, just doing my usual canvass of the area. But something about the owner's smile didn't reach his eyes when he said he'd never seen Jessica Martinez. My partner thought I was reaching, trying to connect dots that weren't there, but I couldn't shake it. That night I went home and spread out all my case files on the kitchen table. 4 victims, different ages, different backgrounds, but they all had one thing in common. The nightcap was their last known location. I started digging into the building's history. That's when I found them. The tunnels, miles of them, running under the city from Prohibition days. Bootleggers used them to move liquor. I went back to the nightcap after hours, just to look around. That's what I told myself. The basement door was unlocked. I still don't know if he meant for me to find it. The entrance to the tunnel was behind an old wine rack, the air down there musty and thick with decay. My flashlight beam caught something metallic on the ground, a badge, Martinez's badge. Then I heard it, footsteps echoing off the stone walls, and his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Detective Katie, I was wondering when you'd figure it out." He had recreated it all, every detail from the Valentine's Day massacre, the Tommy guns mounted on the wall, the chalk outlines. Even the angle of the bodies was exactly the same. He'd been studying, practicing, perfecting his craft. I reached for my gun, but he was faster. The last thing I remember was the cold press of steel against my temple and his whispered words, "Time to make history." I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. They found me on the steps of the precinct, barely alive. The nightcap was empty when they raided it. No evidence, no bodies, no owner, just a perfectly preserved speakeasy and miles of empty tunnels beneath. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear his footsteps echoing in those tunnels. And I know he's out there, somewhere, planning his next masterpiece. It took me 6 months to recover. Physical therapy, counseling. The whole department treated me like I was made of glass, but I never stopped searching. Every night after my shift, I'd go through the files again, looking for something, anything I might have missed. That's when the postcards started arriving, always postmarked from different cities, each one featuring a historic photo of another speakeasy. No message, just a date written on the back. At first I thought they were random, then I realized they were all dates of unsolved murders from the Prohibition era. He was leaving me a trail, taunting me. The latest one came yesterday. The postmark was local, downtown LA. The photo showed the King Edward Hotel circa 1928. Their speakeasy was legendary, hidden behind a fake wall in the basement, just like the nightcap. But this postcard was different. It had a message, and "Ready for an encore, detective?" I should have called for backup, should have followed protocol, but something told me if I didn't go alone, he'd disappear again. The hotel's been abandoned for years. Graffiti covers the walls, broken windows, trash everywhere. But the basement was pristine, like stepping back in time. The bar gleamed in the dim light, crystal glasses lined the shelves, and there he was, sitting at the piano, playing something slow and jazzy like he'd been waiting for me all along. "You've done your homework, detective," he said without turning around, "but then so have I." That's when I noticed the walls, covered in photos, surveillance photos, of me. For months he'd been watching, studying, learning my patterns, just like his other victims. "You're right about one thing," I said, drawing my weapon. "I did do my homework." The backup team burst in right on cue. We'd been planning this for weeks, tracking the postcards, setting up the sting. He just smiled, that same cold smile from the nightcap. As they led him away in cuffs, he leaned close and whispered, "You know what they say about history, detective. It has a way of repeating itself." They found the bodies, all of them, perfectly preserved in the old tunnels, posed to match murders from nearly a century ago. His attention to detail was immaculate. The papers called him the speakeasy killer, but I knew better. He wasn't just recreating history, he was perfecting it. Every detail, every angle, every drop of blood, making it better, making it his. He's in maximum security now. God, I can't sleep most nights anymore. I just lie there replaying everything I found in those tunnels beneath the city. The footage is gone, all of it, but I swear I can still see every frame when I close my eyes. Look, I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've covered tough stories before, but this was supposed to be different. Just a simple piece about the homeless communities living in the abandoned subway tunnels. The kind of story that wins Indie Awards and gets you noticed, right? I spent my first month down there just getting to know everyone. These people had built something incredible in the darkness, their own little society. They had markets where they traded whatever they could find, these cozy spots where someone always had a pot of coffee brewing, even this amazing library made from books people had thrown away. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, in its own way. That's when Michelle grabbed my arm one night. I'll never forget the look in her eyes, pure fear. She told me people were vanishing, not the usual kind of disappearances you get in homeless communities, but something else, something worse. They take them past the yellow line. She kept saying, into the old maintenance tunnels. Nobody comes back from there. Of course I didn't buy it at first. You hear all kinds of stories in places like that. But then weird stuff started happening. I noticed walls that had been sealed up with fresh concrete, even though these tunnels hadn't seen official maintenance in decades. At night, the worst sounds would echo through the darkness, and whenever I asked the older residents about the eastern section, they'd just shut down, like they were terrified of even talking about it. Then I found that room. It wasn't on any of my maps, just this hidden service area filled with filing cabinets. Inside, medical records, experiment logs, documents signed by people I recognized from City Hall. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the camera while I filmed it all. They were using homeless people as test subjects, new drugs, surgical procedures, stuff that would make you sick just reading about it. I recognized names from my interviews, people who just disappeared one day. That's when I heard them coming, 2 guys in hazmat suits claiming to be maintenance workers, but the way they looked at me and those syringes they were carrying, I knew exactly what they were. I ran like hell. Through every tunnel I could find, lungs burning, heart pounding. They kept calling after me in these calm voices, saying they just wanted to talk. But I'd seen what their talks looked like in those files. When I finally made it back to the main tunnels, I thought I'd won. Then I checked my camera. The memory card was gone. They'd somehow snatched it while I was running. I tried telling everyone, police, newspapers, local news stations. Nobody would touch it. Called me a conspiracy theorist, said I needed help. But I know what I saw in those files. Every name, every sick experiment they're still doing down there. I keep thinking about going back, getting proof, but I see them watching my apartment now. Men in suits across the street, footsteps outside my door at night, heavy boots on the stairs when I'm working late. I know they're waiting, just looking for the right moment to make me disappear too, to turn me into another file in their cabinet. The worst part? Knowing it's still happening. Right now, under our feet, they're still taking people, still experimenting, and I'm the only one who knows. Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy for even writing this down. But somebody has to know the truth, has to understand what's really happening in those tunnels, before they come for me too. I tried reaching out to Michelle last week, thought maybe she could help me prove what was happening, but when I went back to the tunnels, nobody had seen her for days. Her little corner where she used to sell handmade jewelry was empty, just an old blanket and some scattered beads on the ground. I asked around, but everyone just shook their heads and walked away. They knew. We all knew where she'd gone. I've started keeping a journal of everything I remember from those files, every detail, every name, every procedure. It's hidden where they'll never find it. If anything happens to me, at least there'll be some record of the truth. Maybe that's all I can hope for now. Yesterday, I noticed my phone acting weird, strange clicks during calls, messages disappearing. They're getting closer. I can feel it, but I'm not gonna stop. I can't. Too many people have already disappeared into those tunnels, too many lives erased like they never existed. Someone has to remember them. Someone has to keep fighting, even if I'm next. I never wanted this job in the city archives, not with my condition, but here I am trying to piece together a pattern that nobody else can see. When you can't recognize faces like me, you learn to notice other things. The way people move, their mannerisms, the tiny details that make each person unique. That's what made me notice something was wrong in the first place. I was cataloging security footage from the old tunnel system, just routine work after the third maintenance worker disappeared. The police thought they were dealing with separate incidents, but I saw it. The same watch, the same peculiar way of holding a coffee cup, the same distinctive limp, except attached to completely different faces. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. My prosopagnosia playing tricks on me again. That's what my coworkers call my face blindness when they're being polite about it. Usually they just joke about how I can't tell them apart. But this was different. I started mapping it out, tracking the footage. The same person was appearing over and over. Different faces, different clothes, but always those same telling details. I tried explaining it to Detective Morris, the way the suspect would touch his left ear before speaking, the slight hesitation in his step. She didn't understand at first. How could she? She was too focused on facial recognition software, trying to match faces that I knew weren't the same person. But I kept digging, started noticing patterns in the tunnel access logs, maintenance schedules that didn't quite add up, strange equipment requisitions. Then the fourth worker vanished. I was reviewing the footage when I saw him again. Our mystery man. But this time, something was different. He looked directly at the camera and smiled. He knew I was watching. That's when it hit me. He must have prosopagnosia too. That's how he was doing it. Using the tunnels to switch identities, wearing different faces that he couldn't even see himself, just like me. The irony wasn't lost on me. My greatest weakness had become my greatest strength. I could track him in ways others couldn't, see past the faces he was hiding behind. The next day, I found a note on my desk. It takes one to know one. My hand shook as I read it. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt a strange sense of purpose. I knew I had to stop him, because I was the only one who could see him for who he really was. Even now, as I write this, I can feel him watching, waiting, playing his game of faces in the shadows of the tunnels, but he doesn't realize I'm watching too. And unlike everyone else, I can see right through him. Last night, I stayed late at the office reviewing more footage. That's when I noticed something in the background of an older tape. A maintenance room I'd never seen before, hidden behind what looked like a regular wall panel. I cross-referenced it with the original tunnel blueprints. Nothing. It wasn't supposed to exist. I couldn't tell Detective Morris. Not yet, not without proof. So I did something stupid, really stupid. I went down there alone. The tunnels were different at night. Every footstep echoed. Every shadow seemed to move. I found the panel exactly where I'd seen it in the footage. It slid open easily, too easily, like it had been used recently. The room behind it was small, cramped, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned to the walls, but not normal photographs. Each one showed the same person, our killer, wearing a different face. He'd labeled them, cataloged them, just like I would in the archives. And there, on a small table, surgical tools, prosthetics, the tools of his trade. I was so focused on the discovery that I almost missed it. That familiar sound, the slight hesitation in his step, the way he touched his left ear before speaking. Fascinating, isn't it? His voice came from behind me. I didn't turn around, didn't need to. I knew exactly who it was, even if I couldn't recognize the face he was wearing. "You're the only one who's ever noticed," he said, the only one who could see past the faces. I felt something cold press against my back. We could work together, you know. Think about it. Two people who see the world the way we do. But he was wrong. We weren't the same. I'd spent my whole life learning to see people for who they really were, beyond their faces. He'd spent his taken faces away. I had one advantage. In the darkness, in the chaos that followed. It didn't matter what face he wore, I could still track his movements, anticipate his patterns. When the police finally found us, led by Detective Morris, he was wearing his last face, the one he'd planned for me. They still don't understand exactly how I did it, how I could fight someone whose face kept changing, but they don't need to understand. Some mysteries are better left in the dark, where they belong, in the shadows of the tunnels, where faces don't matter anymore. I used to think my anxiety was lying to me, that the world wasn't really as dangerous as my mind made it seem. Now I know better. My name is Anna. I run a true crime podcast from my basement apartment, the only place I've felt safe for the past 3 years. The irony isn't lost on me. I spend my days researching the worst things that can happen to people while hiding from my own fears. But that's not what this story's about. This is about the day I realized my fears weren't big enough. It started with the sounds. Living in a basement, you get used to certain noises, pipes groaning, footsteps above, the hum of the building's machinery. I knew them all by heart. That's why the new sound caught my attention right away. A rhythmic tapping, too deliberate to be random, too irregular to be construction. At first I ignored it, blamed it on the city's endless underground work, but then I started recording it for background ambiance in my podcast. That's when I noticed the pattern. 3 short taps, 2 long ones, a pause, then repeat. It took me 2 days to realize it was Morse code. My hands were shaking as I translated it. Almost ready. Ready for what? I had to know. I set up better recording equipment, directional microphones, vibration sensors. The sounds were coming from behind my storage closet. And they were getting closer. That's when I found it. A loose panel behind my winter coats. My heart was thundering as I pulled it away, revealing a narrow tunnel. The brick walls looked ancient, but the metal support beams were new. Fresh wiring ran along the ceiling, disappearing into darkness. I should have called someone, should have reported it. But who would believe an agoraphobic podcaster who never left her apartment? Besides, this was the biggest story of my career, right in my own walls. I set up more sensors, started mapping the sounds. They formed a web beneath the city, spreading out from key structural points. The pattern was deliberate, methodical. Someone was targeting the foundations of our city's oldest buildings. I spent sleepless nights monitoring the frequencies, documenting every tap and whisper that echoed through my walls. My podcast listeners noticed the change in my voice, the edge of panic that crept in when I discussed urban legends about underground tunnels. If they only knew the truth lurking beneath their feet. One night I intercepted another message. Charges set, awaiting signal. My blood ran cold. It wasn't construction at all. Someone was planning to bring the city down. Literally. I had proof. But leaving my apartment, facing the outside world, that was my worst nightmare. The walls seemed to close in around me. The weight of the city above pressing down, crushing me with the responsibility of what I knew. The next message made my decision for me. Detonation in 48 hours. I couldn't let my fear condemn thousands of people. Sometimes the only way to face your fears is when something bigger comes along. I packed my hard drives, my hands trembling as I gathered every recording, every scrap of evidence I'd collected. The journey up those basement stairs was the longest of my life. Each step felt like climbing a mountain. The sunlight hit my face for the first time in months, harsh and unforgiving. But I kept moving. The police station was 6 blocks away. Every car horn made me jump. Every stranger's glance sent shivers down my spine. But the evidence in my bag kept me going. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that the danger was real this time. The desk sergeant looked at me like I was insane until I played the recordings, the Morse code messages, the mapping of the tunnel system, the detonation countdown. Within hours, the bomb squad had found the first set of charges, then another and another. A network of explosives placed at critical points throughout the city's foundation. They arrested the group behind it 3 hours before the planned detonation, a domestic terrorist cell that had spent years planning to bring our city to its knees. My recordings, my fear of leaving my safe space, had saved countless lives. The mayor wanted to give me a medal. I accepted it via video call from my apartment. Some habits don't change overnight. I still live in my basement apartment, still run my podcast, though now it has a different focus. Urban infrastructure, underground threats, the hidden dangers that most people never notice. My listeners have tripled. Turns out people love a true crime story where the anxious hermit becomes the unlikely hero. But I know the truth. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who learned that sometimes. Being afraid of the right things is what keeps us alive. The sound still comes sometimes, distant tapping in the walls. But now I know. It's just the city's heartbeat, the rhythm of life flowing beneath our feet. And when I get scared, when the walls feel too close and the world too big, I remember that day. The day I learned that courage isn't about being fearless.